My Jewish mother kicked me out of the house for coming home with an inappropriate tattoo, so as revenge, I burned her house down. I came home one night to my Jewish family brandishing a new Nazi tattoo draped across my chest. As soon as my mom saw it, she told me I was no longer welcome in this house. I was obviously stunned to hear this, so I got in her face. "You're kicking me out?" "No, the F you're not." That's when my dad stormed in. When he noticed my tattoo, he struck me using his palm. He put so much force that I fell over and my chest crashed into the edge of a chair. I stood up and yelled, "You want me to go? Fine, but mark my words, I'll be back." I went upstairs, packed my things, smashed the mirror in the bathroom out of drunken rage, and walked out. The last thing I said to my mother was, "You'll pay for this with your life." Now, I suppose I should explain why I got the tattoo. You see, I never wanted to follow the Jewish faith. It was so traditional and boring, between the holidays and religious schooling, and always going to the Shabbat service. The worst part was the rabbi. His services were long and tedious, but my parents forced me to stay. Now that I'm 18, I could mark how I want to live my life. Well, after getting kicked, I called up one of my buddies who put me onto the tattoo. He had this group I found on Facebook, and they had ideas that went against the norm, which I liked. They didn't have any restricting rules and taught me that certain people are just better. When I joined this Facebook group, they initiated me and said that I should get the matching tattoo that all members had, which was what I got. That day felt like freedom. For the first time in my life, I wasn't bound by the suffocating traditions and rules my parents shoved down my throat. I felt like I was finally taking control of my own path. The Facebook group gave me a sense of belonging that I had never had before. They didn't see me as a disappointment or a failure like my parents did. They saw me as one of them and treated me like a brother. I crashed on my friend's couch that night. He understood what I was going through. He'd been kicked out of his house too for different reasons, but we shared that bond. We spent hours talking about the group. Then he asked me if I wanted to go out for the night to celebrate, and I was confused. I had gotten kicked out of my parents' house. He said that we needed to go out to celebrate the fact that I stood up for what was right and said we could call up a couple of the members to go out with us. He said they'd be proud of me. We went out that night, and it was fun, but I couldn't help but feel the betrayal from my parents sting me. These guys had become my new family. They had a vision for the world that made sense, a world where the strongest ruled. My parents always taught me that everyone was equal and that we had to care for others, but the group showed me otherwise. Why should I care about people who didn't care about me? Why should I sacrifice my happiness for the sake of tradition? The more I talked with the group, the more I started to see my parents for what they really were: weak. They clung to their traditions because they were scared of the world and the truth. They hid behind their religion because they couldn't face reality. Well, I wasn't scared anymore. I wasn't going to be like them. After that night out with the boys, I knew I had to make my parents' life a living hell. I started out small. The next week, I went by my parents' house late at night, after they were asleep, and spray-painted symbols on the driveway and the garage door. My friend from the group came with me. He was on the lookout. By the time I was done, there were symbols all over the outside of the house. I wanted them to wake up the next morning and be reminded of what they'd lost. I wanted them to feel the same pain I felt every time they forced me to sit through one of those endless services, and the same anger that built up inside me every time they told me I had to be something I wasn't. I knew it hurt them. I could see it in their eyes when my mom FaceTimed me, crying, but I didn't stop. Every time they'd clean them off, me and my friends would be there again to trash their house and spray paint messages on the windows. The calls didn't stop either. My mom continued to beg me to stop and even said I could come back home. She still thought she could fix me and that I'd come home if she just said the right thing, but I wasn't coming back. Not ever. After a few weeks, I got bolder. One night, I slashed the tires on our family car. That was the only car my family owned, and my dad used it daily to go to work. I lingered around in the bushes until the morning when my dad came outside to find his minivan with 4 flats. He called for my mother inside the house, and it felt good watching them panic, knowing they were stranded. They couldn't run from what they'd done to me anymore. They couldn't just pretend everything was fine. My dad didn't call me this time, but I could tell he was furious. He stormed into the house, and I crouched just outside the living room window. From where I sat, I could hear my father's voice. He was venting not just about vandalism, but also about me. It was as though I had become a stranger to him. He said I was someone he didn't recognize anymore. It was clear that he believed I was too far gone, and I was no longer the son he had tried to raise. And then there was my mother. I could hear the desperation in her voice. She hadn't given up on me yet. I could tell she believed I wasn't beyond saving. She said that this was some terrible phase, and with enough time, I would return to the boy she remembered. When my dad wanted to call the police, she refused to involve any authorities, even though I had given her every reason to do so. My mom eventually convinced my dad not to call the cops. I let off a couple of weeks after that to make it seem like I had given up, but I wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. A few nights later, I was sitting around the dingy basement of my buddy's place, the air thick with smoke and the smell of stale beer. I could feel the eyes of the group on me. I took a drag of a cigarette, leaned back, and tried my best to sound cool. I slashed their tires, and I spray painted the house again. You should have seen my dad's face the next morning. He didn't even know what hit him. It was perfect, I told them. For a moment there was silence. Then one of the guys, Cal, one of the older ones in the group, gave me this slow nod. "Attaboy," he said, clapping me on the back. "You're really coming into your own, man. Didn't think you had it in you at first, but you're proving us wrong." The others started nodding and murmuring in approval. The feeling of being accepted was becoming addicting, and to hear them say they were proud of me gave me a rush that I hadn't felt in years. But then, Cal leaned in a little closer and said that I'd been doing some real good work with my family, but there was more out there that I could be doing. He was referring to a new family that recently moved into their neighborhood. They were the only dark people in the neighborhood, and Cal hated it. He told me they thought they were better than us, and that they were making their house value drop. He asked me if I wanted to join him in paying them a visit soon. I knew what this meant he was going to off them. I couldn't disagree with him. This was the first time they seemed proud of me, and if I refused, they would probably kick me out. I couldn't go back to my parents' house, and I knew that this was the only option. Cal told me that I was one of them now, and said I proved myself. He asked me if I was ready for the next steps. Without hesitation, I nodded. The rest of the group exchanged glances and grinned like they knew something I didn't, and I wasn't scared. I was excited. The night we went after the new family's house was dark. I rode in the back seat with Cal and the others, my heart pounding not with nerves but with anticipation. The plan was laid out. I'd heard the others talk about it before, about how they'd burned down houses, left families with nothing, and slipped away like ghosts. When we got there, the house was quiet. We moved like shadows and crept around the back. I watched as Cal poured the gasoline in a careful line along the base of the house. It was almost methodical, like he'd done it 100 times before. My job was simple: light the match. And as I stood there staring at the house and the windows where a family was probably sleeping, I struck the match, and the fire caught in an instant, roaring to life. We left before the flames got too big. By the time the fire trucks came, we were long gone, and I could already picture the chaos we left behind. The family stumbling out into the street, watching everything they had burned to the ground. As we drove away, I felt a huge adrenaline rush. It was like all the anger I'd been carrying, all the resentment toward my parents, toward everything they represented, had found an outlet. Taking it out on that family, seeing their lives crumble. It was satisfying in a way I didn't think was possible. A few days later, I was back in the basement with the guys. They were all laughing, patting me on the back, telling me how good of a job I'd done, but I couldn't stop thinking about that house. And that's when the idea hit me. If I could do it to them, if I could destroy their home and their memories, why couldn't I do the same to my parents? But this time, I wouldn't just burn things. I'd take what mattered most to them, their precious heirlooms. They valued these more than anything. I could see it clearly in my mind, the look on my mom's face when she realized that the menorah, the Torah, and all of those priceless relics of her family's history were gone. It would crush her, and my dad would know it was me. He'd know that his son had taken everything they held dear, and I would be satisfied, more than satisfied. One evening, I waited until I knew they'd be out. It was a Friday night, Shabbat. It was perfect. I went inside and tore the place apart. I smashed the family pictures and ripped up the furniture. I wanted them to come home to chaos. The best part had to be destroying their religious stuff, the menorah, the Torah scroll they kept in the study. It felt like every religious thing that they'd forced on me couldn't bother me anymore. I shattered it all. I remember standing over the broken pieces of the menorah, the one that had been in my mom's family for generations, and feeling nothing but satisfaction. They deserved this. When they came home, I wasn't there to see their faces, but I knew my mom definitely cried. My dad probably cursed me again, but I didn't care. I'd made my point. Later that same night, I went back to the house, this time with a can of gasoline. I knew they were inside, asleep, and used the exact same tactics that Cal taught me: light it and leave without a trace. I poured the gasoline around the back of the house, lit a match, and watched as the flames started to spread. At first, it was exhilarating. I felt powerful, like I was finally in control. But as the fire grew, panic set in. I didn't mean for it to get so out of hand. The flames were bigger than I'd imagined, and the smoke was choking me. I ran, heart pounding as the fire consumed everything. By the the time I got far enough away, I could hear the sirens. My parents must have woken up, must have called 911. I watched from a distance as the firefighters tried to save what was left of the house. Most of it was gone. The next morning, I woke up to the police at my buddy Alfred's house looking for me. They told me I was under arrest, and I went with them without much struggle. My parents pressed charges. My mom had given up on me. My dad didn't say anything or try to talk to me. I was put on trial for arson. They told the court how I'd been acting out, how I'd vandalized their house and destroyed their things. I didn't deny any of it. I'd done all those things. But as I sat there in the courtroom listening to my parents talk about me like I was some kind of monster, something inside me snapped. I wasn't the villain here. They were. They were the ones who kicked me out, who refused to let me live my life the way I wanted. They were the ones who pushed me to this point. But none of that mattered in court. The judge didn't care about my reasons. He just saw what I'd done, and he sentenced me to 5 years in prison. It's been a few months since I was let out of prison, and I've had a lot of time to think. I thought I was fighting for my freedom, for my right to be who I wanted to be. But now I wasn't so sure anymore. I haven't heard much from Alfred or Cal after my sentencing, and began to wonder if I made a mistake. I didn't know if my parents would ever forgive me. I didn't know if I even want them to. But as I sit here, day after day, replaying everything that happened, I realize that maybe I was wrong.